Welcome to this quiet space where time slows down and the world outside fades into a soft and distant hum. Tonight, we are not here to rush toward a destination or to carry the weight of expectations on our shoulders. We are here simply to rest and to let your breath settle like dust motes, dancing in a sunlit study as they slowly and gently find their place on the surface of stillness. Close your eyes now, if you have not already, and feel the weight of your body sinking into the surface beneath you. Feel the support of the bed or the chair or the floor holding you safely so that there is nowhere you need to be. And nothing you need to do except listen to the sound of my voice. And let it guide you into a state of deep and peaceful relaxation. Allow your shoulders to drop away from your ears and let the tension in your jaw soften until your face feels smooth and calm. Close your eyes now if you have not already and feel the weight of your body sinking into the surface beneath you. Feel the support of the bed or the chair or the floor holding you safely so that there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen to the sound of my voice and let it guide you into a state of deep and peaceful relaxation. The light comes from a single candle whose flame steadies as the draft from the window fades and casts long soft shadows against walls made of stone and wood. Outside the window, the hills of Tuscany stretch into the distance where olive groves shimmer silver under. The late afternoon light that is slowly turning into night. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls not urgently but with the patient rhythm of time itself passing. Through monastery walls and village squares alike. You are not in a temple of science nor a palace of power, but in a quiet room where one man sat night after night with a long tube of glass and wood resting on the edge of his desk. The tube points upward like a question no one had yet learned how to ask properly. And it waits in the silence for someone to lift it and look through its lens. This is not the story of a revolution shouted from rooftops, but of a revolution whispered into the dark. It is the story of a telescope that did not invent truth, but simply gave the sky permission to speak plainly for the first time in centuries. Galileo did not set out to overturn the heavens because he only wanted to see them more clearly. In that wanting, and in that quiet insistence on looking for himself, he changed the way humanity listens to the stars. Even now, 400 years later, when you tilt your head back on a clear night and feel the ancient pull of wonder, you are standing where he once stood with your eyes open in the same direction. As we move together through the corridors of his life, we will walk through candlelit laboratories and echoing lecture halls, and hear the rustle of forbidden manuscripts passed hand to hand. Allow your mind to soften and settle like the surface of a pond after the last ripple has faded, and let each sentence carry you forward gently without urgency and without alarm. You are safe here, and there will be no equations thrown at you and no accusations and no trials shouted in capital letters. There will only be the slow and steady unfurling of a man who trusted his eyes more than his textbooks and who discovered to his quiet astonishment that the universe was far kinder to curiosity than it was to certainty. If you would like, send a note in the comments, not as a review or a demand, but as a little message to tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. You might tell me what constellation you can see above your window, or simply share the feeling of the room you are in. I read every one of them not as statistics, but as fellow travelers resting beneath the same sky. Galileo once mapped with trembling hands and a heart full of awe. If this journey brings you even a moment of stillness, consider following the channel, because history at its best is not a lesson to be memorized, but a lullaby to be remembered. The night we are about to enter is not loud, and it does not thunder with cannons or blaze with fire. Instead it hums with the low and steady hum of a turning lens and the soft scrape of a quill across paper and the distant echo of a father teaching his daughter how to count the moons of Jupiter by lamplight. Outside, the world still believes the sun circles the earth, not because it is foolish, but because it has grown comfortable with the shape of its own shadow. Inside this room, beneath a roof open to the stars, a man prepares to hold up a mirror not to himself but to the sky and ask gently, what if we have been listening to the wrong story? Let your shoulders relax and let your thoughts slow to the pace of ink drying on paper. We are not racing toward a conclusion tonight because we are walking step by step into a time when seeing was an act of courage and truth wore the quiet face of patience. Our story does not begin with the telescope itself, nor with the trial that would later define his name in textbooks. It begins much earlier, with a world convinced it already knew everything worth knowing, and with a boy in Pisa who could not stop asking, what if we look again? Feel how the narrative wraps around you like a heavy blanket on a cold night, and know that you are held within this history just as surely as the stars are held within the sky. There is no need to remember dates or names because the only thing that matters is the feeling of wonder that passes from one generation to the next. Let that feeling settle into your chest and let it warm you from the inside out as you prepare to drift into the first chapter of our journey. The air in the room grows stiller as we approach the beginning, and the candlelight seems to soften until it is barely more than a glow in the darkness. You are ready to enter this world not as an observer but as a participant in the quiet act of listening. The wood of the desk feels solid beneath your hands, and the glass of the lens feels cool and smooth against your fingers. Everything is in place, and everything is waiting for you to take the first breath of this new story. Let go of any remaining tension and allow yourself to be carried by the flow of the words. The path ahead is clear, and it is lined with the soft light of curiosity and the gentle shadows of the past. We begin now in the silence before the discovery, when the world was whole and complete and certain of its own center. Listen to the quiet and let it fill the space between your thoughts. The journey starts here in the stillness, and it moves forward with the grace of a turning planet. Welcome to the story of Galileo and the telescope, and welcome to the rest that awaits you in the depths of history. The world before Galileo was not confused or lost in darkness, but was instead deeply certain of its own place in the grand design of things. It knew with the quiet confidence of centuries how the heavens moved and how the earth sat still at the center of creation like a jewel in a ring. Every soul had a proper place in this great design, and that certainty was not a cage that trapped the mind, but a cradle that rocked it to sleep each night. It was a structure of belief so carefully woven into the fabric of daily life that even the wind seemed to whisper its approval as it passed. Through open monastery windows and over candlelit desks where young scholars copied ancient texts with trembling hands and steady devotion, there was no need to question the shape of the sky because the answer had been given long ago by voices that sounded like authority and wisdom combined. The universe was a home, and everyone knew where the walls were and where the floor stood and where the ceiling arched above them in perfect symmetry. This sense of stability was not merely an intellectual concept, but a physical sensation that people carried in their bones. Whenever they walked across a field or stood upon a stone bridge, the ground beneath their feet felt solid and unmoving, and it provided a foundation for every thought and every prayer and every dream that arose. During the course of a lifetime, In the cities of Europe, the sky was not a frontier to be explored with ships or maps, but a dome painted long ago by divine hands that stretched from horizon to horizon without break or flaw. It was a perfect sphere turning with silent grace, carrying stars fixed like jewels in a ceiling of infinite depth that never faded or changed their positions relative to one another. The planets danced in elegant and predictable circles around a waiting Earth that stood firm and unmoving like a stone altar in a temple. This was not ignorance of the world, but an inheritance of wisdom that had been passed down like a family heirloom, polished by time and handled with care. It was the wisdom of Aristotle, refined by Ptolemy and blessed by the Church, and whispered into the ears of every child who learned to read by tracing the curve of a celestial sphere in a leather-bound atlas. To question it would have been like questioning why the sun rose in the east or why the seasons followed one another in order. It was not done out of fear of punishment, but out of respect for a truth that had held the world together for longer than memory could reach. The stars were not distant suns, but lanterns hung in the firmament to guide the traveller and mark the seasons and remind humanity that there was an order greater than themselves watching over the fields and the cities and the quiet rooms where people slept. Walk with me now through a street in Florence near dusk, where the golden light settles on cobblestones worn smooth by generations of footsteps that have passed over them for hundreds of years. The air carries the scent of baking bread from the ovens down the lane and warm wax from votive candles flickering in the church doorway, where the shadows dance softly against the stone walls. There is a faint tang of ink drying in the scriptorium upstairs, where monks sit with their heads bowed over parchment that smells of lambskin and gall nuts. A priest passes by nodding gently to a mother who lifts her child just high enough to see the sundial mounted on the wall of the square. It is the same sundial that has told the hour for over 200 years, and its shadow moves in faithful accordance with the heavens above without deviation or error. The child points at the shadow and the mother smiles, because the world makes sense and the time is known and the sun will set where it always sets. This rhythm of daily life was synchronized with the movement of the sky, so that when the bells rang for vespers, the stars were already beginning to appear in the deepening blue, and when the rooster crowed at dawn, the eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten with the promise of day. Nearby, in a quiet courtyard shaded by the leaves of a fig tree, a tutor sits with two boys who are listening with wide eyes to the lesson of the day. He points to a diagram drawn in the dust with concentric circles that are labelled with names that sound like music, such as Moon and Mercury and Venus, and Sun and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. Each one orbits obedient and harmonious around the still heart of all things, which is the earth beneath their feet. The boys do not frown or hesitate when they hear this, because it matches what they see when they look up at the night sky from their beds. They trace the lines with their fingers and nod, because this is not theory to them, but the shape of reality itself. They feel the ground solid under their sandals, and they see the stars moving above them, and the connection between the two is clear and unbreakable. There is a comfort in this order that feels like a heavy blanket on a cold night, and it wraps around the mind and keeps the cold winds of doubt from entering. The knowledge they are learning is not something to be tested, but something to be received like a gift from those who came before and who watched the same sky and drew the same conclusions with patience and care. Even the language of the time reinforced this harmony in every conversation and every prayer and every song that was sung in the taverns or the cathedrals. Words like order and balance and place were not abstract concepts discussed by philosophers in distant towers, but were the bricks and mortar of existence for the baker and the blacksmith and the sailor. A farmer planted his seeds according to the position of the moon, not because he had calculated its gravity or understood its pull, but because the almanac said so, and the almanac had never been wrong in living memory. He trusted the book because the book trusted the sky, and the sky had never failed to bring the rain or the sun when it was time. A sailor steered his ship by the North Star, trusting that it would remain fixed and unmoving and eternal, just as God had set it on the first night of creation. He did not worry that the star might move or vanish, because the stories of his father and his grandfather said it would always be there to guide him home. The ocean was vast and dark, but the sky above was a map that never changed and that provided a sense of safety to those who ventured far from the sight of land. In monasteries across the continent, monks rose before dawn, not only to pray but to record the motions of the heavens in ledgers bound in calf leather that smelled of age and dust. Their hands were steady and their hearts were at peace, because they were not discovering new things that might upset the order, but were witnessing the eternal dance that had been ordained from the beginning. They were keeping watch over a cosmos that needed no correction and only reverence, and their ink was a form of prayer written on paper. They noted the eclipses and the comets not as anomalies, but as part of the grand schedule that had been written in the stars. There was no anxiety in their work, because there was no possibility of error in a system that was designed by perfection. The universe was a clock, and God was the clockmaker, and the monks were simply the keepers of the time, who ensured the hours were marked correctly. Their lives were measured by the cycles of the sun and the moon and the stars, and this measurement gave meaning to their days and structure to their nights. And yet, beneath this serene surface, something stirred, not as rebellion or anger, but as a quiet friction, like the first hint of wind before a change in season that you feel on your skin before you see the leaves move. In distant universities, where the lamps burned late into the night, and in private letters passed between scholars who feared to speak aloud in the market squares, small questions gathered like dew on the grass. They asked why Mars sometimes looped backward in its path when it should have moved forward in a perfect circle. They asked why the planets did not move with perfect circular grace, but with a subtle and uneven wobble that did not fit the diagrams drawn in the dust. These were not challenges shouted from rooftops, but whispers, soft and almost apologetic, spoken more to the stars than to other men. They were written in the margins of old manuscripts where ink had faded but curiosity had not, and they waited for someone to read them and understand their weight. The scholars who wrote these notes did not feel like revolutionaries, but like careful observers who noticed a thread that was slightly loose in the tapestry and wondered if it might be pulled gently to see what lay beneath. For now these questions were folded into the greater harmony like a single out-of-tune string on a lute that no one yet dared to retune because the song was too beautiful to stop. The musicians played on, and the listeners clapped, and the discord was ignored or explained away with complex mathematics that added more circles to the diagrams to make them fit. The world was not waiting for Galileo, and it did not sense his coming or prepare for the shift that was to come. It was simply living and breathing and believing, with its feet planted firmly on the earth and its eyes lifted gratefully to a sky that had promised for over 1,000 years to remain exactly as it was. There was a profound safety in this stillness and a deep comfort in the knowledge that the center of everything was where you stood. You did not have to wonder if you were drifting through a void, because you knew you were standing on the anchor of creation. The night sky was a ceiling and the earth was a floor, and there was a reassurance in knowing that the house of the universe was built on solid ground. In that stillness and in that beautiful and unshaken confidence lay the full weight of the known world that pressed down gently on the shoulders of every person alive. It was the kind of weight that does not crush but comforts, like a heavy blanket on a cold night, or the hand of a parent on a child's head. It told you that you were important and central, and that the universe revolved around your daily life and your prayers and your work. To lose this weight would be to lose the ground beneath your feet and to float away into a darkness that had no center and no edge. Galileo would not tear that blanket away with force or anger because he understood the comfort it provided to the human heart. He would only lift one corner ever so slightly and whisper that there is more beneath it than we thought, and that the view from the other side is also beautiful. He would not destroy the home, but would simply open a window to let in a new kind of light. But for now the window is closed and the room is warm and the candle burns steady on the desk. So let yourself rest in this moment of history where the world is whole and complete and certain of its own name. Feel the solidity of the ground beneath you and the stability of the sky above you, and the peace that comes from knowing your place in the order of things. There is no rush to change anything tonight, and no need to solve the mysteries of the universe before you sleep. You can simply exist in the warmth of the known world and let the certainty of the past wrap around you like a cloak. The bells are tolling in the distance, and the candles are burning low, and the stars are fixed in their places just as they have always been. It is a time of rest and a time of trust, and a time before the question was asked that would change everything. Breathe in the scent of the old paper and the wax and the dust, and let it settle in your lungs like a memory of a place you have never been but somehow know. The world is quiet, and the world is sure, and you are safe within its walls. Let the heaviness of this certainty become the heaviness of your own eyelids as you drift deeper into the comfort of the known world. Let the rhythm of the spheres become the rhythm of your breath, and let the stillness of the earth become the stillness of your body. You are held here in this moment just as the world was held in its place before the telescope turned its eye toward the dark. In the city of Pisa, where the Arno River winds through stone bridges and narrow streets like a slow-moving thought, there lived a boy who did not rush through the days of his youth. He walked the same paths as other children, past the baker's oven, where loaves browned in the morning light, and past the cobbler's stall, where leather creaked under careful hands, but where others saw routine, he saw rhythm. He noticed how rain fell not in straight lines, but in slanted threads when the wind rose, and how the flame of a candle leaned before the door even opened, as if the air itself had a weight and a direction that could be felt before it was seen. He watched the pendulum of the cathedral lamp set swinging by a careless hand and returning again and again to the same arc, as if time itself had a favourite pace and refused to be hurried. This was not genius in its infancy, but attention practised like a quiet prayer. He stood still in the vast coolness of the cathedral while others hurried to their prayers, and he let the swing of the brass lamp measure out the seconds in his mind, matching the beat of his own heart to the motion of the metal. There was a profound peace in this observation, a sense that the world was speaking a language of patterns and ratios that required only stillness to understand. The stone floor beneath his feet was cold and solid, and the echoes of footsteps faded slowly into the high, vaulted ceiling, and in that silence he found a companion in the movement of the lamp that seemed to promise that some things in life return to where they began with perfect reliability. Galileo Galilei was born into a world that honored reason, but only when it walked in step with tradition, and his home was a place where this tension was felt gently like a string tuned slightly tight. His father Vincenzo was a musician and theorist, no revolutionary, but a man who believed that truth could be tested even in harmony. In their home, music was not only beauty but mathematics made audible, and the air often vibrated with the sound of lutes and viols being played not for performance but for investigation. Young Galileo learned early that a string half the length of another did not merely sound higher, but sang an octave, as if the universe had built its own tuning fork into the fabric of things. He watched his father press a finger to a lute string and listen not just with his ears, but with his whole body, with head tilted and breath suspended, as though the note were a sentence still waiting to finish. That posture, the leaning in, and the stillness before understanding would become Galileo's own throughout his life. He learned that knowledge was not something you seized, but something you invited by creating the right conditions for it to reveal itself. The smell of rosin and polished wood filled the rooms, and the light from the windows fell across the sheets of music, where notes were written like secret codes waiting to be deciphered by those patient enough to read them. He was not a solitary child, nor a brooding one, and he laughed with his siblings in the courtyard and climbed the fig trees behind the house and traded small jokes with the apprentices at the apothecary down the lane. Once he pretended to read the stars in a spilled cup of wine, tracing constellations in the dregs, while the others groaned and threw crusts of bread at him, and that was the first telescope he ever used, which was imagination guided by affection. But when the laughter faded and the light softened into evening, he would often linger on the roof, lying on his back with his hands folded over his chest and watching the sky turn from gold to indigo to black. He was not searching for omens, and he was not counting angels, but simply letting the scale of it settle over him, like a cool cloth on a fevered brow. He did not feel small beneath the stars, but felt addressed, as if the vastness above was acknowledging his presence with a silent nod. The air on the roof was cooler than in the streets below, and the sounds of the city became a distant hum that allowed him to hear the quiet rhythm of his own breathing matching the slow turn of the heavens. This nightly ritual was not a study session, but a communion with the infinite, where he learned that being small was not a weakness, but a position of clarity from which to view the whole. At the University of Pisa, where he studied medicine at his father's urging, he sat through lectures on humours and temperaments with polite attentiveness, but his mind wandered not away, but deeper into the nature of things. He noticed how professors spoke of Aristotle as if he was still in the next room, ready to correct any misstep, and how students nodded not because they understood, but because agreement was easier than doubt. The lecture halls were dusty and filled with the scent of old parchment and the scratch of quills, and the light fell in heavy bars across the wooden benches where young men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And yet, one afternoon, during a lesson on motion, the lecturer claimed that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, which was a belief so old it had worn smooth like a stone in a riverbed. Galileo said nothing aloud, but later in the courtyard he picked up two stones, one rough and heavy and one smooth and light, and held them one in each hand, feeling their weight not as facts but as questions. He did not drop them then, but waited because he wanted to be sure not of the answer, but of his own willingness to look. The sun was warm on his neck, and the shadows of the university buildings stretched long across the grass, and in that moment of holding the stones, he felt the weight of centuries of assumption resting in his palms. This was the foundation of his courage, which was not defiance, but fidelity to observation and to patience and to the quiet insistence that seeing comes before speaking. He did not set out to overturn the cosmos, but only wanted to listen more closely to what it was already saying. And in a time when knowledge was often passed down like an heirloom, polished and unquestioned and displayed behind glass, Galileo treated truth like a conversation that required presence and repetition and the humility to say, "Let me try that again." His notebooks from those early years are not filled with proclamations, but with sketches of water swirling down a drain and of shadows lengthening across a wall and of smoke rising in uneven spirals from a brazier. He wrote in the margins, "Not this proves, but what if," which was a phrase so gentle it barely disturbed the page. He made mistakes, many of them, and he misjudged the acceleration of falling bodies at first and confused refraction with reflection and trusted flawed lenses until they cracked under the strain of his hopes. But he never hid them, and he crossed them out lightly and added a note and turned the page, because his mind was not a fortress but a workshop. The workshop was warm and slightly cluttered and filled with half-finished instruments and the smell of sawdust and oil, where failure was not shame but material for the next attempt. The tools on his bench were worn smooth by use, and the light from the window illuminated dust motes dancing above the work surface where lenses waited to be ground. He spent hours polishing glass with fine powders and checking the curve against the light until the distortion vanished and the world appeared sharp and true. This work was meditative and required a steady hand and a calm breath, and it taught him that clarity was not given but earned through repetitive and gentle action. The sound of the grinding stone was a low hum that filled the room and marked the passage of time, not in hours but in layers of glass removed with patience. He understood that to see further one had to first learn to see clearly what was near, and that the quality of the lens mattered more than the power of the claim. In that workshop, long before the telescope and long before the trial and long before the world knew his name, Galileo was already doing the work that would change everything. He was learning how to be still enough to hear the universe whisper and how to trust the evidence of his own eyes over the comfort of ancient words. There was a tenderness in the way he handled his instruments, as if they were extensions of his own senses, and he cleaned them carefully after each use and stored them in wooden boxes lined with soft cloth. He knew that the tools of discovery were fragile and required care, just like the truths they revealed. He would sit for long periods without moving, testing the alignment of a tube or the balance of a weight and letting his mind settle into the problem until the solution arose like a bubble in water. This patience was not passive but active, and it required a deep reservoir of inner silence that he cultivated through years of observation. He learned to distinguish between the noise of opinion and the signal of reality, and he trained himself to wait for the signal to become clear before he spoke. The world outside was busy and loud and full of people eager to declare their certainty, but inside his workshop there was only the quiet work of refinement. He was building not just devices, but a method of thinking that valued questions over answers and process over conclusion. This mindset was his true inheritance from his father, who had taught him that music was not just sound but relationship, and now he was learning that nature was not just matter but relationship too. As the seasons changed outside his window, he remained constant in his practice, and the leaves turned from green to gold and fell to the ground, and the snow came and covered the hills, and still he worked at his bench. The changing world outside mirrored the changing understanding inside his mind, and he felt no anxiety about the passage of time because he knew he was moving towards something real. He walked through the streets of Pisa and Padua and saw the same people doing the same things, but he saw them now with a new depth, knowing that Beneath the surface of daily life there were forces at work that could be measured and understood. He saw the water in the canals and thought of flow and resistance, and he saw the birds in the sky and thought of trajectory and gravity. Everything was a lesson and everything was a text, and he was reading the world with a hunger that was never satisfied but always nourished. This hunger was not a lack but a presence, and it filled him with a sense of purpose that kept him warm during the cold winters and focused during the hot summers. He was alone often, but he was never lonely because he was in the company of the things he studied, and they spoke to him in a language he was slowly learning to fluency. And so the boy who watched the lamp in the cathedral became the man who would teach the world too. Watch the stars, and the transition was not a sudden leap but a gradual unfolding, like a flower opening to the sun. Each observation was a petal, and each question was a stem, and the whole plant grew slowly toward the light of truth. He did not know where this path would lead him, and he did not seek fame or fortune, but only the satisfaction of knowing that he had seen clearly. The silence he listened to was not empty, but full of potential, and it waited for him to ask the right questions to release its secrets. He carried this silence with him wherever he went, and it protected him from the noise of controversy and the pressure of expectation. It was a private sanctuary that no one could enter and no one could take away, and it was the source of his strength when the world later turned against him. But for now, in these early years, there was only the work and the wonder and the quiet joy of discovery. The mind that listened to silence was becoming a mirror for the universe, and the reflection it held was becoming clearer with every passing day. Let this image of the quiet workshop and the patient observer settle in your mind as we prepare to move forward into the next chapter of the story where the lens will finally meet the sky. It began not with a declaration or a published treatise or even with a telescope, but with a question held lightly like a coin turned over and over in the palm of the hand until its weight became familiar and its edges smooth. Galileo was teaching mathematics in Padua by then, and the position gave him modest security and just enough freedom to let his mind wander beyond the syllabus and into the quiet corners of curiosity. The university hall where he lectured was tall and cool, and its stone walls echoed with the shuffle of students' feet and the dry scratch of quills on paper. Sunlight streamed through high windows in the late mornings, drawing golden rectangles across the floor, and Galileo would sometimes pause mid-sentence, not because he had forgotten his point, but because he had just noticed how the dust motes within that light did not fall straight down, but swirled and hesitated, and drifted as if the air itself resisted simplicity. He did not write that observation down immediately. He carried it with him, letting it settle beside other fragments like the way water rose in a suction pump only so high, or the way a ball rolled faster as it descended a slope, or the way sound arrived after lightning, and not with it. These were not anomalies to him, but invitations to look closer at the fabric of the world. His workshop was not grand, and it did not stand out among the other buildings of the city. It occupied a corner of his rented home, where shelves held half-carved wooden models and brass fittings, still warm from the forge, and stacks of paper marked with sketches that blurred the line between geometry and poetry. He built devices not to impress but to test and to make the invisible tangible and the abstract measurable. There was a ruler with grooves for rolling balls and a water clock calibrated by counting his own pulse, and a pendulum suspended from the ceiling beam with its swing timed against the steady drip of a pierced bucket. He did not trust instruments that answered too quickly. He preferred tools that required presence and you had to watch and wait and adjust and try again. His hands knew the grain of wood and the cool slickness of polished metal and the faint resistance of a screw tightened just past ease. These were details that no textbook could teach, but that whispered truth in their own quiet language. The room smelled of sawdust and oil and the faint metallic tongue of tools that were used every day. It was a sanctuary of focus where the noise of the city outside faded into a background hum that allowed the mind to settle into the work at hand. Then came the news from the north, and it was not shouted but passed in letters and in traveller tailies and in the hushed excitement of scholars meeting over wine in dim taverns. In the Netherlands, men were fitting lenses into tubes and claiming to see distant things as if brought near. Some said it was trickery and others dismissed it as a toy for sailors. But Galileo, who had spent years studying optics not for fame, but for clarity, felt something stir. He thought about how light bends and how vision distorts and how the eye itself is both witness and interpreter. He felt not certainty but recognition. He sat at his desk one evening after supper, and the room was lit only by a single beeswax candle whose flame steadied as the draught from the window faded. He began to sketch not from memory and not from rumour but from first principles. He drew convex and concave glass and focal points and angles of refraction. By dawn he had a design. It was not the best, and it was not the most powerful, but it was his own. The paper was covered in lines and circles and notes, written in his neat slanting hand that mapped out the path of light through a tube. The first telescope he assembled was crude and humble in its construction. It was a lead tube salvaged from a broken pipe and to lenses. One lens was purchased from a spectacle maker in Venice, and the other was ground slowly by his own hand over days of fine sand and oil. He held the glass between thumb and forefinger until the curve caught the light evenly. The process of grinding the lens was meditative and required a rhythm that matched the breath. He would apply the abrasive powder and move the glass in a circular motion and listen to the sound of the friction. It was a soft scratching sound that filled the room and marked the passage of time. Not in hours, but in layers of glass removed with patience. He checked the curve against the light again and again until the distortion vanished and the world appeared sharp and true. This work was not rushed. It was a conversation between the hand and the material where the glass taught the hand how much pressure to apply and the hand taught the glass how to hold the light. When he finally fitted the lenses into the tube and held it up to his eye, the world did not explode with revelation. He pointed it toward the bell tower of San Marco and the bricks simply came closer. They were sharper and more textured with cracks and lichen visible for the first time. A man walking halfway up appeared not as it, but as a person with the hat tilted against the sun and one hand resting on the stone railing. Galileo lowered the tube and he did not cry out. He did not call his neighbors. He walked inside and poured himself a cup of cold water and sat very still for several minutes. He let the implications ripple through him like rings on a pond after a single stone has fallen. He thought about what it meant to bring the distant near and to make the invisible visible. He asked himself, what if this instrument could look beyond towers and beyond hills and beyond the reach of any human foot? He asked himself, what if it could reach the sky, not as a symbol but as a place? The idea was not a thunderclap but a slow dawn that spread across his mind. He improved the device in small and patient increments. He made longer tubes and better alignment. He polished lenses until they held the light without distortion. With each version the world opened a little wider, and not with a fanfare but with a sigh of recognition. It was as if the universe had been waiting for someone to finally adjust their focus. The workshop became a place of pilgrimage for his own curiosity, where each night brought a new refinement and each morning brought a new view. When he finally turned the instrument toward the heavens, it was not on a night chosen for ceremony but on an ordinary autumn evening that was cool and clear and the kind that invites quiet reflection. He mounted the telescope on a wooden stand he had carved himself, and he braced it with sandbags to steady the tremor in his hands. The tremor was not from fear but from the sheer weight of anticipation. He looked through the lens, and the moon did not appear as the smooth silver disk poets sang of. It rose textured and pitted and mountainous. Its terminator line was jagged with shadowed valleys and sunlit peaks. He sketched what he saw not as art but as testimony. He wrote beside it in his neat slanting hand that the surface is not smooth and uniform and precisely spherical as a great number of philosophers believe it to be. He wrote that it is uneven and rough and full of cavities and prominences. There was no exclamation mark. There was only observation offered gently like a gift wrapped in plain paper. The light from the moon fell across his desk and illuminated the sketch, and the ink seemed to glow with the same silver light. These were not grand gestures, they were daily choices. He chose to stay up past midnight and to sand another lens and to recheck a measurement. He chose to resist the urge to announce before he was sure. Each step forward was small and almost invisible to those around him. But like water seeping into stone, they were changing the shape of what was possible. Galileo was not building a revolution. He was building a new way of looking. He was teaching the world how to see again, one careful glance at a time. The silence of the night outside was profound, and it wrapped around the house like a blanket. Inside the workshop the candle burned low and the shadows lengthened on the walls. The telescope rested on its stand like a sleeping animal waiting to be woken again. Galileo sat back in his chair and let his eyes rest. He knew that he had crossed a threshold, but he did not know where it led. He only knew that the sky was no longer a painting on a ceiling but a landscape that could be explored. The process of seeing changed the seer. Galileo felt a shift in his own perception. He walked through the streets of Padua and he saw the world differently. He noticed the way light fell on the buildings and the way shadows defined the shape of things. He saw the depth in the faces of the people he passed and the texture of the stone under his feet. The lens had taught him that there is always more than meets the eye and that truth is often hidden in the details. He carried this awareness with him like a secret warmth. He did not speak of it loudly. He kept it in his chest where it glowed quietly. He continued his work in the workshop and he continued his lectures in the hall. But there was a new intensity in his gaze and a new patience in his voice. He was no longer just teaching mathematics. He was teaching attention. He was showing his students how to look at the world without preconceptions and how to let the evidence speak for itself. The seasons changed outside the workshop window. The leaves turned from green to gold and fell to the ground. The snow came and covered the hills, and still he worked at his bench. The changing world outside mirrored the changing understanding inside his mind. He felt no anxiety about the passage of time because he knew he was moving towards something real. He walked through the streets and saw the same people doing the same things, but he saw them now with a new depth. He knew that beneath the surface of daily life there were forces at work that could be measured and understood. He saw the water in the canals and thought of flow and resistance. He saw the birds in the sky and thought of trajectory and gravity. Everything was a lesson and everything was a text. He was reading the world with a hunger that was never satisfied but always nourished. This hunger was not a lack but a presence. It filled him with a sense of purpose that kept him warm during the cold winters and focused during the hot summers. He was alone often, but he was never lonely. He was in the company of the things he studied, and they spoke to him in a language he was slowly learning to fluency. The lens itself became a companion. It was not just a tool but a partner in the discovery. He cleaned it carefully after each use and stored it in a wooden box lined with soft cloth. He knew that the tools of discovery were fragile and required care, just like the truths they revealed. He would sit for long periods without moving, testing the alignment of the tube or the balance of a weight. He let his mind settle into the problem until the solution arose like a bubble in water. This patience was not passive but active. It required a deep reservoir of inner silence that he cultivated through years of observation. He learned to distinguish between the noise of opinion and the signal of reality. He trained himself to wait for the signal to become clear before he spoke. The world outside was busy and loud and full of people eager to declare their certainty. But inside his workshop there was only the quiet work of refinement. He was building not just devices, but a method of thinking. He valued questions over answers and process over conclusion. This mindset was his true inheritance from his father, who had taught him that music was not just sound, but relationship. Now he was learning that nature was not just matter, but relationship too. And so the man who watched the dust motes in the sunlight became the man who would teach the world to watch the stars. The transition was not a sudden leap, but a gradual unfolding like a flower opening to the sun. Each observation was a petal, and each question was a stem. The whole plant grew slowly toward the light of truth. He did not know where this path would lead him. He did not seek fame or fortune. He only sought the satisfaction of knowing that he had seen clearly. The silence he listened to was not empty but full of potential. It waited for him to ask the right questions to release its secrets. He carried this silence with him wherever he went. It protected him from the noise of controversy and the pressure of expectation. It was a private sanctuary that no one could enter and no one could take away. It was the source of his strength when the world later turned against him. But for now, in these early years of the telescope, there was only the work and the wonder and the quiet joy of discovery. The mind that listened to silence was becoming a mirror for the universe. The reflection it held was becoming clearer with every passing day. Let this image of the quiet workshop and the patient observer and the lens that learned to see settle in your mind as we prepare to move forward into the next chapter of the story, where the stars will begin to move. There came a night that was unremarkable in the weather reports and uncelebrated in the town records, when Galileo lifted his telescope toward Jupiter and saw something that should not have been there according to the maps of the world he had inherited. It was not a blur caused by the tremor of his hand, and it was not a trick of the lens caused by imperfections in the glass, and it was not a smudge of dust on the surface that could be wiped away with a cloth. It was 3 small points of light aligned, with the planet like beads on a thread, and then on the next night there were 4. And they were not fixed in their position, and they were not obedient to the established laws of the heavens. They shifted sometimes to the left and sometimes to the right, and sometimes they vanished behind the giant world only to reappear on the other side, as if Jupiter were not a wandering star but a center of its own small cosmos. He did not shout when he saw this, and he did not run to the square to announce the news to the merchants and the priests. He simply sat longer at his desk while the candle burned low and the wax pooled around the base, and his fingers traced the positions on a fresh sheet of paper again and again until the pattern became undeniable. These were not stars fixed in the firmament, they were moons. Moons that circled something other than the earth. The air in his study grew thick, not with tension but with significance, the kind that settles when you realize you have just overheard a secret the universe kept for millennia. It was a heavy silence that filled the room and pressed gently against the windows where the night air waited outside. He named them the Medicean stars, not out of flattery, though there was gratitude for patronage, yes, but more deeply for the quiet space it gave him to keep watching without interruption. Night after night he returned to the same window and the same wooden stand and the same careful stance, as if approaching a sacred threshold that required bare feet and a bowed head. And each time the sky answered him with a clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful. Venus, that bright evening jewel, no longer shone with a steady and featureless glow as the poets had sung of for centuries. Through the lens it showed phases crescent and gibbous and full just like the moon, and that detail so small to the naked eye carried a weight far heavier than stone, because if Venus circled the earth, as Ptolemy claimed, it could never show a full phase. But if it circled the sun, if all the planets did, then its changing face made perfect and elegant sense. The heavens were not lying. They were rearranging themselves in real time for anyone willing to look long enough to see it. He wrote these findings not in bold proclamations designed to shock the sensibilities of the scholars, but in careful letters written with ink that flowed smoothly from the quill. He sent them first to trusted friends and then to scholars across Italy. And each copy was sealed with wax and delivered by couriers who did not know they carried not news but quiet earthquakes that would shift the ground beneath their feet. In Florence, a young astronomer read Galileo's description of Jupiter's companions and stepped outside his own observatory into the cold night air. He built a similar device in haste using lenses he had ground himself and stood shivering in the Pradon chill until he saw them too. He saw for tiny lights steadfast in their dance around the giant planet, and then he sat down on the stone steps and wept not from sorrow but from the sheer relief of no longer being alone in what he had seen. In Padua, a theology student tucked the letter inside his copy of Aquinas and reread the passages on divine order, his finger pausing over phrases about the immutability of the heavens. He wondered whether God's design might include movement so subtle it had taken 1,000 years to notice, and whether truth could be larger than the words used to describe it. The world did not shatter when these letters arrived, and the sun still rose in the east and the market still opened at dawn. It simply shifted like a painting hung slightly crooked for decades, and then just once seen from a new angle, revealing the true line of the horizon beneath. In the marketplace, life continued as before, and merchants weighed olives and children chased pigeons, and priests blessed loaves for Sunday Mass. But in a handful of studies and in monasteries with clear southern views, and in the homes of instrument makers who began grinding new lenses with unusual care, a different kind of work began it was not a work of rejection but of reconciliation. They asked how Aristotle's wisdom and Galileo's moons could coexist, and whether it was possible to love the old stories and still welcome the new ones. These were not questions shouted in debate halls where egos clashed like swords. They were murmured over wine and scribbled in margins and carried silently in the chest like a second heartbeat that beat in. Time with the turning spheres. Even the stars themselves seemed to lean in to witness this change in perspective. On clear winter nights, when the air was so still it felt glassed over and the cold bit at the cheeks the Milky Way no longer appeared as a soft and luminous smear across the darkness. It became a river of countless distinct points, each one a sun perhaps with its own unseen worlds waiting to be discovered. Galileo sketched this not as proof to be wielded like a weapon, but as an invitation to be shared like a meal. Look, the drawing seemed to say, just look. And slowly and hesitantly others did. A noblewoman in Venice borrowed a telescope from her brother and draped a shawl over her nightgown to ward off the chill. She stood on her balcony until her feet grew cold watching Saturn's strange and flattened shape, which she described in her journal as looking like ears. She wondered whether beauty required symmetry or whether mystery was its own kind of perfection. A ship's navigator preparing for a spring voyage began charting Jupiter's moons not for doctrine but for practicality. He thought that if these bodies kept time so reliably they might one day help sailors find longitude at sea and save ships from crashing on unseen rocks. The implications were not political yet. They were intimate. They belonged to the quiet space between observation and understanding, the space where belief is not overturned, but gently asked to make room for something larger. Galileo did not claim to have discovered truth in the absolute sense. He claimed only to have removed a veil, and even that he did with humility and a trembling hand. He knew the danger was not in seeing, but in being seen seeing. So he moved slowly and deliberately like a man walking on ice who tests each step before committing his weight. He published his Starry Messenger not as a manifesto designed to rally troops, but as a report modest in tone and rich in detail. It was illustrated with his own delicate drawings that showed the mountains of the moon and the stars of the Milky Way. It was as if he was handing the reader a key and saying, "You may try the lock yourself." And many did. Not all believed, and some dismissed the moons as optical illusions and the phases as lens defects caused by flawed glass. But others who were quiet and thoughtful and careful looked and looked again. They found that the sky no longer whispered the same old story it had told for generations. It spoke now in a different rhythm, one that did not deny the past but asked it to step aside just enough to let something new be born. The nights stretched out into weeks and the weeks into months, and the telescope became an extension of his own eye. He learned to trust the instrument as much as he trusted his own breath. He learned that the lens did not distort the world but revealed it in a depth that was always there waiting. He would stand in the garden where the grass was wet with dew and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. He would adjust the focus until the image sharpened and the chaos of the night resolved into order. It was a meditative practice that required patience and stillness and a willingness to be wrong. He made errors in his calculations, and he misinterpreted some of the shadows on the moon. But he corrected them quietly and without shame, because the goal was not to be right, but to be clear. The clarity he sought was not a sharp blade that cut through ignorance, but a soft light that illuminated the path forward. It was a light that allowed others to walk beside him without fear of stumbling. There was a profound loneliness in those nights of observation, but it was not a bitter loneliness. It was the loneliness of the watchman who sees the dawn before the rest of the village wakes. He knew that soon others would see what he saw, and the loneliness would fade into community. But for now he was the sole witness to a dance that had been performed for billions of years without an audience. He felt a responsibility to record it accurately so that the dance would not be forgotten. He dipped his quill into the inkwell, and the scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the house. The ink dried slowly, and the words formed a bridge between the sky and the earth. He wrote about the shadows and the light and the movement and the stillness. He wrote about the beauty of the unknown and the comfort of the known. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, and then he blew out the candle and sat in the dark. In the dark, the images remained burned into his vision, and the moons of Jupiter continued their silent orbit behind his eyelids. The seasons turned, and the cold of winter gave way to the mildness of spring. The flowers bloomed in the garden, and the birds returned to the eaves of the house. But the sky remained the same constant companion. It did not change with the weather or the mood of the people. It simply was. And Galileo learned to find peace in that constancy. He learned that the earth might move, but the truth remained still. He learned that the opinions of men were like clouds that passed across the face of the sun, but the light itself was unchanged. He carried this knowledge with him like a stone in his pocket. It was heavy, but it grounded him. When the winds of controversy began to blow, he would touch the stone and remember the night he saw the moons. He would remember the silence of the study and the cold of the glass and the warmth of the discovery. He would remember that the sky did not care about his reputation or his safety. It only cared about being seen, and he had seen it. And that was enough. The letters continued to arrive from across the continent, and some were supportive, and some were skeptical, and some were fearful. He read them all with the same calm attention. He did not argue with the skeptics, and he did not boast to the supporters. He simply thanked them for their letters and invited them to look through the lens. He knew that words could not convince where sight could. He knew that the eye was the final judge in matters of the heavens. So he kept the telescope ready and the lenses clean and the stand steady. He waited for the visitors who were brave enough to come and look. Some came and looked and were changed. Some came and looked and closed their eyes tight. He respected them all. He understood that the light could be blinding if one was not ready for it. He did not force the light on anyone. He only held the lamp and waited for them to step into the glow. And so the stars refused to stay in place, and the world began to turn on a new axis. It was not a violent turn, but a gradual tilt like the slow change of the seasons. The ground beneath the feet of the scholars felt slightly different, and the air tasted slightly sharper. The old certainties did not vanish, but they lost their absolute power. They became stories instead of laws. And in that space between story and law, freedom began to grow. The freedom to question, and the freedom to look, and the freedom to be wrong. Galileo sat in his study and watched the dust motes dance in the sunlight. He thought about the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus. He thought about the people who would look through the telescope after he was gone. He hoped they would feel the same wonder he felt. He hoped they would not fight over the truth but share it. He hoped they would remember that the sky was big enough for everyone. He blew out the candle and the room went dark. but the stars outside were still shining, and they were still moving, and they were still waiting. The first resistance did not arrive with trumpets or edicts or the slamming of heavy doors, but came in the form of a pause that lingered a moment too long in the air. It was a hesitation in a handshake that was usually firm, and a letter that arrived, sealed with an extra layer of wax, as if the contents were too dangerous to be touched by casual hands. It was a dinner invitation that never came, despite a promise made weeks before and a glance exchanged between two courtiers that vanished as soon as Galileo turned his head. In the salons of Florence and the lecture halls of Rome, the name of Galileo began to echo differently than it had in the years of celebration and applause. He was no longer spoken of as a scholar to be consulted for his brilliance, but as a presence to be managed with care and caution. Conversations about his observations still took place in the corners of rooms where the light was dim and the voices were low, but now they carried a new undertone, like the low hum of a string slightly out of tune that vibrates politely but refuses to settle into harmony. The words were measured and careful, not to rise too high or too fast, because everyone sensed that the ground beneath the discussion had become unstable, and that a wrong step could lead to a fall that no one wished to witness. Dominican friar, who had once been a cordial guest at Galileo's table and who had shared bread and wine with him in laughter, now crossed the street rather than meet his eye when their paths intersected in the market square. It was not done with malice, but with a protective instinct that prioritized safety over friendship in a time when alliances were shifting like sand dunes in the wind. A cardinal who had once praised his mathematical clarity, and who had invited him to demonstrate the telescope in the Vatican gardens, now spoke of him in the third person, even when Galileo was standing in the same room listening to the conversation. The cardinal would say that one must admire his skill, though one must also consider the harmony of doctrine, and the words were not hostile, but they were heavier than hostility because they carried the weight of institutions that had stood for centuries. They were protective of tradition and of order and of a world that had spent generations learning how to live inside a single story without questioning the walls that held it together. In the Vatican's inner circles, where the light filtered through stained glass and cast-colored shadows on the stone floors, theologians gathered not to condemn with fury, but to reconcile with sorrow. They pored over scripture and ancient texts, not as judges seeking error, but as menders trying to repair a tear in a beloved tapestry without cutting away too much of the original weave that held it together. The rooms smelled of beeswax candles and dust, and the ink they used to write their concerns was dark and permanent on the parchment. Some argued that the command for the sun to stand still could be read poetically as a metaphor for God's power over time, rather than a literal description of planetary motion. Others reminded their brothers that St. Augustine himself had warned against tying faith too tightly to a specific interpretation of nature, because God gave humanity to books to read. He had written that one book was Scripture and the other was the world, and if they seemed to contradict, it was likely that humans had misread one of them, rather than the Creator having made a mistake. But misreading, even with good intentions, could unsettle more than it clarified, and could shake the confidence of those who needed the world to remain fixed and certain. Clarity in matters of heaven and earth was no longer a neutral gift that could be given freely, but was becoming a responsibility and sometimes a risk that required careful handling. Galileo, for his part, did not retreat into silence, nor did he charge forward with the anger of a man who feels wronged. He moved with the grace of a man walking a narrow ridge high above a valley who is aware of the drop on either side and places each foot with deliberation and care. He wrote letters not in defiance of authority, but in devotion to the truth he had seen and to the faith he held in his heart. To the Grand Duchess Christina he spoke not of rebellion against the Church, but of reverence for the creation that the Church served. He wrote that the intention of the Holy Spirit is to teach us how one goes to heaven, and not how heaven goes, and the words were gentle but firm, like a stone set into a wall. He attended church every Sunday, and knelt as the others did and sang the same hymns, with a voice that did not waver. Afterward he walked home, with his head bowed not in submission to men but in thought about the vastness of the universe and the smallness of human disputes. He knew the danger was not in seeing the truth with his own eyes, but in making others feel they had to choose between what they believed in their hearts and what they saw in the sky. And so he chose his words as carefully as he ground his lenses to correct without condescension and to illuminate without blinding those who were not yet ready to look directly at the light. Even among his friends, tension gathered like dew on the grass in the early morning, which is quiet and inevitable and impossible to ignore until the sun rises high enough to burn it away. A fellow mathematician, after a long evening discussing Jupiter's moons and the phases of Venus, placed a hand on Galileo's arm and spoke softly with a voice full of genuine concern. He said that Galileo had given them eyes they did not ask for, and that he should not be surprised if some prefer to keep them closed to avoid the discomfort of a new view. A Jesuit astronomer who had verified Galileo's findings with his own telescope and who knew the evidence was sound published nothing to avoid controversy, but sent a single line in a private note sealed with care. He wrote that he saw what Galileo saw and that he prayed for the wisdom to speak of it in time when the world was ready to hear it without fear. These were not betrayals of friendship, but human responses to a truth that arrived too soon for comfort and disrupted the peace of mind that many had cultivated over a lifetime. Faith and reason were not enemies in their hearts, but like two rivers meeting their confluence required new banks and new depth and time to settle into a new course without flooding the surrounding land. In the palace corridors of the Medici, where frescoed ceilings depicted gods and heroes in eternal motion and the floors were polished marble that echoed every footstep, courtiers began to speak of Galileo in coded terms. They called him the man with the tube, or the stargazer, or the one who listens to the sky, and the names were spoken with a mixture of admiration and caution. Some admired him openly and commissioned small telescopes as fashionable curiosities to point at the moon during evening garden parties, while servants passed trays of candied figs and almond wine. Others exchanged glances when his name arose over dessert, and their smiles became tight, and their forks lingered a moment to long in the air before returning to the plate. Power does not always speak in decrees shouted from balconies, but sometimes it speaks in silence in the space between what is said and what is left unsaid. It speaks in the weight of a withheld endorsement and in the coolness of a gaze that once held warmth and now holds only polite distance. The shadows in the corners of the great hall seemed deeper, and the silence between conversations grew longer, as if the walls themselves were listening to ensure no words were spoken out of turn. And Galileo returned each night to his study, where the world of power could not reach him, and lit his lamp and opened his notebook and wrote with a steady hand. He did not write faster in a panic nor louder in anger, but clearer in his resolve to document what he had witnessed. He knew that ideas, like seeds, do not demand thunder to grow and do not require armies to defend them. They ask only for soil and for time and for the quiet courage of those willing to tend them in the dark until they are strong enough to break the surface. He dipped his quill into the inkwell, and the scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the house, and it marked the passage of time more reliably than any clock. He wrote about the motions of the planets and the nature of the tides and the behavior of light, and he did not shy away from the evidence even when he knew it would be difficult for others to accept. He understood that the truth does not belong to the person who speaks it first, but to the future that will verify it when the noise of the present has faded away. The night air outside his window was cool and carried the scent of jasmine and damp earth, and the stars above were indifferent to the troubles of men below. They continued their silent dance regardless of the opinions of cardinals or the fears of courtiers, and their constancy was a comfort to him in moments of doubt. He would pause in his writing and look up at the ceiling as if he could see through the tiles and the wood beams to the sky beyond. He remembered the feeling of the cold brass of the telescope under his hands and the way the world sharpened into focus when he adjusted the lens. That clarity was what he sought to preserve in his words, a clarity that was not harsh but revealing, like the morning light that shows the dust motes dancing in a room. He knew that he was walking a path that few had walked before, and that there were no maps for the terrain he was crossing. But he trusted the compass of his own observation and the steady beat of his own heart, which remained calm despite the storm gathering outside his door. There was a profound loneliness in this period of his life, but it was not a bitter loneliness that consumed him. It was the loneliness of the watchman who sees the dawn before the rest of the village wakes, and who must wait in silence for the others to open their eyes. He knew that soon others would see what he saw, and the loneliness would fade into community, but for now he was the sole witness to a shift in the understanding of the world. He felt a responsibility to record it accurately so that the truth would not be lost or distorted by fear. He dipped his quill into the inkwell again, and the ink flowed smoothly onto the page, forming letters that would outlast the voices that sought to silence them. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, and then he blew out the candle and sat in the dark listening to the silence of the house. In the dark, the images of the heavens remained burned into his vision, and the moons of Jupiter continued their silent orbit behind his eyelids, reminding him that the universe was vast and patient. The seasons turned outside the window, and the leaves fell from the trees, and the snow covered the hills, but the work in the study continued without interruption. The changing world outside mirrored the changing understanding inside his mind, and he felt no anxiety about the passage of time because he knew he was moving towards something real. He walked through the streets of Florence and saw the same people doing the same things, but he saw them now with a new depth, knowing that beneath the surface of daily life there were forces at work that could be measured. He saw the water in the fountains and thought of gravity, and he saw the birds in the sky and thought of motion. Everything was a lesson and everything was a text, and he was reading the world with a hunger that was never satisfied but always nourished by the mystery of it. This hunger was not a lack but a presence, and it filled him with a sense of purpose that kept him warm during the cold winters of opposition. He was alone often, but he was never lonely because he was in the company of the things he studied, and they spoke to him in a language he was slowly learning to fluency. The whispers in the corridors of power continued to swirl around him like wind around a stone tower, but the tower remained standing because its foundations were deep. He did not engage in the gossip or the political maneuvering, but kept his focus on the work that mattered to him. He understood that power is temporary and that institutions change, but the laws of nature are constant and endure beyond the lives of men. He found peace in this knowledge, and it allowed him to sleep well at night despite the uncertainty of his position. He would lie in his bed and listen to the sounds of the house settling and the wind in the chimney and feel the weight of the blankets over him. He knew that whatever happened to him, the truth he had seen would remain and would eventually find its way into the light. The whispers would fade and the edicts would be forgotten, but the stars would continue to turn and the moons would continue to dance, and he had seen it. And that was enough to sustain him through the long nights of waiting. It was not a night of storms or omens or dramatic signs written in the clouds, but just an ordinary December evening. In Padua, when the cold had settled deep into the stones of the city and the last embers in the hearth glowed like distant stars waiting to be named. The year was 1610, and the air inside the study was still and heavy with the scent of dried ink and warmed wood and the faint metallic smell of the telescope standing in the corner like a silent companion. Galileo sat alone at his desk, as he often did after his daughters had gone to bed and the household sounds had softened into the quiet rhythm of a sleeping house, but this time something was different, not in the room but in him. The candle burned low and cast long shadows against the walls where shelves held books and instruments, and papers stacked in careful piles. His hands rested on the open pages of a notebook, and his fingers traced the edge of a sketch showing for small dots aligned beside a larger circle labeled Io and Europa and Ganymede and Callisto. He had drawn them many times before on many nights under many different skies, but tonight, for the first time, he did not see them merely as discoveries or mathematical curiosities. He saw them as responsibility. The realization came not with a shock, but with a slow settling like sediment in water until the truth of it was clear and undeniable. At the bottom of his mind, to see was one thing, but to have seen, and to know that others could see if only they had the lens, was another thing entirely. The knowledge was no longer his alone, to keep or to discard. It belonged to the world now, whether the world was ready for it or not. Outside, the city slept beneath a sky so clear it seemed polished like a dark mirror stretched over the roofs and chimneys of Padua. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell quiet again, and somewhere else a watchman called the hour, his voice muffled by distance and woolen cloaks and the thick stone walls of the buildings. The sound was familiar and comforting, and it marked the passage of time in a way that felt safe and human. Inside the study, Galileo reached not for his telescope, but for a letter that lay on the corner of the desk. It was a letter he had carried in his coat for 3 days, unopened, because he had known, without reading it, what it would say. It was from a former student who was now a canon in Rome, and who was a man of gentle faith and sharper intellect. The letter had been written not to accuse but to warn, and the wax seal was broken now, and the paper was creased from being folded and unfolded in a pocket. The words were polite and careful, but the meaning was clear. They are listening, maestro. Not with anger yet, but with fear. And fear once named becomes policy. Galileo read the words slowly, as if they were fragile and might tear if turned too quickly. He read them again, and then a third time, letting the weight of them settle into his chest. Then he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the cover of a book. It was a copy of Copernicus de Revolutionarius, which he kept not on display on the upper shelves, but on the lower shelf behind a volume of Euclid where it would not catch the eye of a casual visitor. He sat back in his chair, and his breath was even and his pulse was steady, but something had shifted in the room. He understood with the quiet certainty of a man who has watched the tide long enough to know when it turns that he was standing at the edge of a choice he could no longer delay. He could keep observing in the margins and keep the truth in his notebooks and let the years pass quietly, or he could step into the light and risk being seen not as a servant of truth but as a threat to peace. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, not to look at the sky because he knew it by heart now, but to feel the cold glass beneath his palm. The glass was smooth and hard, and it grounded him in the real and the tangible and the human. The weight of the telescope on its stand behind him was familiar and comforting, like an old friend presence. But the weight of his own mind was heavier tonight. He thought of his daughters in the next room, breathing in the rhythm of sleep. Virginia was already in the convent, and her letters were growing more pious with each passing month. And she signed them with her new name, Sister Maria Celeste. Livia was quieter and more watchful, and her hands were quick with needle and thread, and her eyes were slower to meet his when he spoke of the heavens. He had given them love and books and music and a home filled with curiosity, and now he carried a truth that could not be tucked into a lullaby or stitched into a hem. He wondered what would become of them if his name became a whisper in the corridors of power, and if his work became a footnote in a condemnation. He did not fear for himself because he was old enough to accept the consequences of his own choices. But silence, when it is chosen not from wisdom but from protection, begins to feel like a kind of forgetting, and he could not forget what he had seen. He could not unsee the moons of Jupiter, or the phases of Venus, or the mountains on the moon. To deny them would be to deny his own eyes and his own mind, and that was a price too high to pay. He returned to his desk and lit a fresh candle because the old one had burned down to a pool of wax. He took a new sheet of paper and dipped his quill into the inkwell and began to write. He did not write a defense or a declaration or a challenge to the authorities. He wrote a description. It was a simple and meticulous account of what the moons of Jupiter had done over the past 40 nights. He wrote down their positions and their rhythms and their unbroken fidelity to a center that was not the earth. He wrote in Italian and not in Latin, so that craftsmen and merchants and curious women in convent libraries might read it, and not just scholars in universities who were trained to argue over words. He included drawings so precise they seemed to tremble with life, and he labeled them with care. He titled it Discourse on the Tides, though it was about far more than water, because it was about motion and about evidence and about the quiet courage of observation. He wrote about how the water moved in response to the earth and the sky, and how everything was connected in a dance that was older than memory. And when he reached the final paragraph, he did not write, "I prove" or "I declare." He wrote, "I offer these things to your consideration, not as one who has arrived, but as one who walks and invites you to walk beside me for a little while under the same open sky." The words were gentle and open, and they left room for the reader to decide for themselves. He knew that truth forced upon someone becomes a weapon, but truth offered becomes a gift. That night he did not sleep, not from anxiety, but from fullness. It was the kind of fullness that comes when a decision has been made not in haste, but in depth, like a root finding bedrock after a long search through soil. He stayed at his desk until the first pale light seeped through the shutters and turned the ink on the page from black to deep blue. That night he did not sleep, not from anxiety, but from fullness. It was the kind of fullness that comes when a decision has been made not in haste, but in depth, like a root finding bedrock after a long search through soil. He stayed at his desk until the first pale light seeped through the shutters and turned the ink on the page from black to deep blue. The cold in the room began to lift as the sun rose over the hills and the shadows retreated into the corners. He sealed the manuscript and tied it with twine and placed it beside the door ready for the courier at dawn. As he blew out the candle, the room did not go dark all at once. The embers in the hearth still glowed with a soft red light, and the stars still shone faintly in the fading sky. And somewhere far away, for small moons continued their slow and silent dance around a giant world unseen by most and unknown to many, but no less real for it. This was not the beginning of conflict in the way history books would later describe it, with shouts and trials and punishments. It was the end of innocence. It was the moment when a private wonder became a public trust. And in that ending something tender and unbreakable was born. It was the resolve to speak gently, but to speak true even when the world prefers a beautiful lie. It was the understanding that clarity is a burden as well as a gift, and that carrying it requires a strength that is quiet and steady. The hours passed and the house began to wake with the sounds of footsteps and the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Galileo remained in his study for a while longer, listening to the sounds of life continuing around him. He knew that the letter would travel and that it would be read and that it would spark conversations in rooms he would never enter. He knew that some would look through lenses and see what he saw, and that others would close their eyes and refuse to look. He accepted both outcomes with the same calmness because he knew he could not control the minds of others. He could only control his own integrity and his own willingness to report what he had witnessed. He stood up and stretched his back, which was stiff from sitting all night, and he walked to the window again. The sun was up now, and the street below was busy with people starting their day. A baker carried trays of bread, and a merchant opened his shutters, and a child ran past chasing a hoop. The world looked exactly as it had the day before, and yet it was different because he knew what he knew. The earth was moving beneath their feet, even if they could not feel it. The sky was deeper and wider than they imagined. And he was the one who had to carry that knowledge for now. He touched the glass of the window again and felt the warmth of the sun on the other side. He thought of the letter waiting by the door and the journey it would take. He thought of his daughters, and he sent a silent prayer for their safety. He thought of the stars, and he thanked them for their silence and their constancy. There was a profound loneliness in that morning, but it was not a bitter loneliness. It was the loneliness of the watchman who sees the dawn before the rest of the village wakes. He knew that soon others would see what he saw, and the loneliness would fade into community. But for now he was the sole witness to a dance that had been performed for billions of years without an audience. He felt a responsibility to record it accurately so that the dance would not be forgotten. He dipped his quill into the inkwell again and wrote a few more notes in his personal journal. He wrote about the light and the shadow and the movement and the stillness. He wrote about the beauty of the unknown and the comfort of the known. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, and then he put the quill down and sat in the quiet. In the quiet, the images remained burned into his vision, and the moons of Jupiter continued their silent orbit behind his eyelids. He closed his eyes and let the darkness rest him. He knew that the day would bring work and visitors and questions, and he would answer them all with patience. But for this moment there was only the stillness and the knowledge that he had done what he had to do. The earth had moved in his mind, and now it would move in the minds of others. The ripple had been cast into the pond, and the waves would travel further than he could see. He breathed in deeply and let the air fill his lungs. He breathed out slowly and let the tension leave his body. He was ready for whatever came next. The night was over and the day had begun and the truth was on its way. Clarity has a weight that is not like the sharp edge of a blade cutting through flesh, but rather like the deep and slow pressure of water, filling a vessel drop by drop until the hand that holds it begins to tremble under the burden. For Galileo, this weight did not arrive all at once in a single moment of crisis, but gathered in small and almost imperceptible moments over the course of many years. It gathered in the way a colleague's greeting grew shorter when they met in the street, and in the hesitation before a door was opened when he arrived for a visit. It gathered in the silence that followed when he spoke of the heavens at a dinner table that was once filled with eager questions and lively debate. He did not lose his position overnight, and he did not wake to find himself exiled to a distant land in chains. But something quieter and more intimate began to erode the ease of belonging that he had once known. The unspoken trust that comes when you and the world agree even silently on how things began to dissolve like sugar in rain. And when that agreement dissolves, even the familiar becomes foreign, and the cobblestones of his street felt harder beneath his feet, and the light in his study seemed dimmer than before. The laughter of his daughters across the courtyard sounded more distant, not because they had changed or loved him less, but because he now carried a truth that could not be shared without risk, and that secret created a space between them that could not be crossed with words. In the year 1616, the congregation of the Index declared that the idea of a moving earth was foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical in theology. The decree did not name Galileo directly, and it did not ban his books from existence. It simply asked him, and the word was asked and not ordered, to abandon completely the Copernican view of the universe. He agreed to this request not out of fear for his own safety, but out of love for science and for the Church and for the fragile possibility that reason and faith might yet walk side by side if given enough time to understand one another. He signed the document with a steady hand that did not shake despite the gravity of the moment. He returned to Florence, and he continued to teach and to write. But something had shifted in the air around him, like the change in pressure before a storm that no one dares to name aloud. Invitations to scholarly gatherings grew fewer, and the letters from friends arrived with longer delays between them. When he walked through the Uffizi gallery, the guards still bowed as was proper, but their eyes lingered a moment too long on his face, as if checking for signs of unrest or defiance. He began to measure time not by the sun or the stars or the ringing of bells, but by the rhythm of absence. He measured the days between replies to his letters and the weeks without a visitor at his door, and the months in which his telescope gathered dust not from neglect but from discretion and caution. The greatest cost of this new life was not professional or financial, but relational and deeply personal. His eldest daughter, Virginia, who had taken the name Sister Maria. Celeste, upon entering the convent, wrote to him with increasing tenderness as the years passed. Her letters were filled with prayers for his health and for his peace and for his obedience, and each word was a soft plea wrapped in devotion and love. She sent him candied citrons from the convent garden that were preserved in sugar and honey, and she mended his shirts with careful stitches that showed her attention to detail. She never once asked him what he had seen through the lens of the telescope, and she never asked him about the trials or the decrees. She protected him with her silence, and he protected her with the same silence in return. In her quiet way, she understood that some truths are too heavy for love to carry openly without breaking under the strain. And so they spoke of fever remedies and of garden herbs and of the chapel's new altar cloth, which were ordinary things sacred in their simplicity. Meanwhile, the unspoken truth sat between them, like a third presence warm and sorrowful, like a hearth that still holds embers long after thee. Flame has died down to ash. He would read her letters by candlelight and trace the loops of her handwriting with his finger and feel the paper thin and fragile in his hands. He knew that she was watching over him from behind the convent walls and that her prayers were a shield around him that no decree could penetrate. Even his body began to bear the weight of the knowledge he carried and the silence he kept. His eyes, which had been strained from decades of peering into the darkness of the night sky, began to weaken, and the world grew softer around the edges. His hands, which were once steady enough to carve brass fittings, finer than a hair's width, now trembled slightly when he lifted a cup of wine or turned the page of a book. He developed a cough that lingered through the winters and became a dry rasp that echoed in the quiet of his study long after the fire had burned low in the hearth. His doctors spoke of age and of damp air and of overwork as the cause of his declining health, but he knew better than to believe them entirely. It was not illness alone that afflicted him. It was the act of holding. He was holding the knowledge that the earth moved when everyone said it stood still. He was holding the memory of Jupiter's moons dancing in perfect orbit around a center that was not humanity. He was holding the silence required to keep speaking at all without causing harm to those he loved. Truth, when it cannot be shared, becomes a kind of solitude, and solitude, when it is sustained for too long, settles into the bones and becomes part of the physical structure of a person. He would sit in his chair and feel the ache in his joints and know that it was the weight of the cosmos resting upon him. And yet, despite the isolation and the physical decline and the quiet erosion of his standing, he did not regret his path. Not once did he wish that he had never lifted the telescope to the sky, or that he had never written the letters that changed the course of history. In the margins of a borrowed copy of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, he wrote a single line that was nearly invisible in faint ink. He wrote that to see clearly is its own reward even when no one else looks. He still walked the garden at dusk when the air was cool and the shadows were long. He still pointed out constellations to the novices who visited from the convent and who looked at him with wonder in their eyes. He still measured the swing of a pendulum not for fame or for argument, but for the simple joy of pattern returning again and again, like a promise kept by time itself. The cost of clarity was real, and it was heavy, and it demanded much from him. But so was its dignity, and so was its quiet joy. It was the joy of knowing that somewhere in the dark the stars still turned, and the moon still rose, and the universe still whispered its old and patient song. And he at least had learned how to listen to that song even when the world around him covered its ears. The house in Arcetri, where he spent his final years, under house arrest, was small and modest, with shuttered windows that looked out over the hills of Florence. The garden sloped gently toward the valley and was filled with roses and herbs and fruit trees that his daughter had helped to plant. He would walk the path slowly, leaning on a cane and feeling the earth solid beneath his feet. He knew that the earth was moving beneath him even if he could not feel it, and that knowledge was a secret comfort. He would sit on a bench under the fig tree and watch the light change on the leaves and think about the nature of motion and light and time. He was no longer a public figure who was celebrated in courts and universities. He was a private man who lived in the shadow of his own discoveries. But the shadow was not dark to him. It was a place of rest and reflection where he could tend to his thoughts like a gardener tends to his plants. He pruned the dead branches of anger and resentment and watered the roots of curiosity and patience. He understood that his work was not finished even if his public life was over. The ideas he had planted were still growing in the minds of others far away, where the Inquisition could not reach them. There were nights when the silence of the house was profound, and the only sound was the ticking of a clock or the hoot of an owl in the olive groves. On those nights he would light a candle and sit at his desk and write not for publication but for himself. He would write about the laws of motion and the strength of materials and the nature of infinity. He would write until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, and then he would blow out the candle and sit in the dark. In the dark, the images of the heavens remained burned into his vision, and the moons of Jupiter continued their silent orbit behind his eyelids. He would think about the people who would read his words after he was gone, and he would hope that they would feel the same wonder he felt. He would hope that they would not fight over the truth but share it like bread among friends. He would hope that they would remember that the sky was big enough for everyone and that there was room for both faith and reason in the heart of a human being. The loneliness of those nights was not bitter, but it was deep, like a well that goes down to the center of the earth. He drew water from that well and drank it and found that it sustained him. The relationship with his daughter remained the anchor of his life during those years of restriction. When she fell ill, he felt a pain that was sharper than any decree or condemnation. He wrote to the convent asking for permission to visit her, but the request was denied by the authorities who feared the gathering of sympathizers. He had to remain in his house while she died in the convent, only a short distance away. He received the news in a letter, and he sat with it for a long time without moving. The grief was a heavy stone in his chest, but he did not cry out. He knew that she was at peace and that she had lived a life of devotion and love. He kept her letters bundled and tied with faded ribbon in his drawer like sacred fragments of a life that was gone. He would take them out sometimes and read them and feel the presence of her spirit in the room. She had protected him with her silence, and now he protected her memory with his own quiet endurance. He knew that her love was part of the legacy he would leave behind just as much as his books and his telescopes. Love and truth were woven together in his life like threads in a tapestry, and one could not be removed without unraveling the other. As the years passed, the world outside continued to change, and the ideas he had championed began to take root in places he would never see. But inside the house in Archetri, time moved slowly and deliberately. The seasons changed, and the leaves fell, and the snow came, and the flowers bloomed again. He aged like the olive trees in the garden, with bark growing rough and branches bending toward the light. He accepted the aging process as he had accepted the movement of the earth. It was a natural law that could not be resisted, and there was peace in that acceptance. He would sit in the sun and feel the warmth on his face and know that the sun was the center of the system and that the earth was carrying him around it. The knowledge did not make him feel small, but it made him feel connected to something vast and eternal. He was a part of the motion and the light and the gravity that held the stars in place. The cost of clarity had been high, but the reward was this connection. He was no longer an observer standing apart from the universe. He was a participant in the great dance of celestial bodies, and that participation was a gift that no authority could take away from him. So let yourself rest in this understanding that truth often comes with a price, but that the price is paid in the currency of integrity and courage. Feel the weight of that integrity in your own body as you lie here in the dark. It is not a burden that crushes you, but a weight that grounds you. It is the weight of knowing who you are and what you have seen. Galileo carried this weight until the end of his days, and he did not buckle under it. He stood straight despite the tremor in his hands and the clouding of his eyes. He stood straight because he knew that the earth was moving and that the stars were suns and that the universe was far larger than the stories men told in courtrooms and churches. You to carry truths that are your own, and you to pay the cost of clarity in your own life. But tonight you do not need to carry it alone. You can lay it down for a while and rest. The earth will keep moving and the stars will keep turning while you sleep. The truth will wait for you until you are ready to pick it up again. For now, let the silence of the study wrap around you like a blanket. Let the memory of the daughter's letters and the scent of the candied citrons and the sound of the pendulum swing you into a deeper state of relaxation. The cost has been paid and the work is done. The clarity remains, and it is yours to keep in the quiet of your own heart. Legacy does not announce itself with fanfare or trumpets or the loud proclamation of kings standing on balconies. It grows quietly like ivy on a stone wall unseen for years until it is suddenly undeniable in its persistence and strength. While Galileo remained under house arrest in Arcetri, his world was reduced to a small villa with shuttered windows and a garden that sloped gently toward the hills of Florence. The walls of the villa were solid and the doors were locked by order of the Inquisition, yet something else was expanding far beyond those walls, slowly and steadily, carried not by decree or force, but by curiosity and the quiet movement of ideas. The physical body of the man was confined to the rooms he knew so well, where the floorboards creaked under. His slow footsteps and the light fell across the dust motes in the same patterns every afternoon. But his mind was traveling distances that no guard could measure, and his words were slipping through the cracks of censorship like water finding its way through rock. Manuscripts slipped between covers of harmless texts, and letters passed through the hands of trusted couriers who knew the weight of what they carried. Their wax seals were unbroken, and their contents were folded just so to avoid suspicion and to protect the truth hidden within the layers of paper. A copy of the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which was banned in Rome, appeared in a printer's workshop in Leiden, disguised as a treatise on classical rhetoric. Its true title was hidden in the colophon like a secret whispered at the end of a long embrace, and the pages were printed with care by men who knew they were participating in something larger than themselves. The ink smelled of iron and oil, and the paper was rough under the thumb, but the words were clear, and they waited for readers who were ready to receive them. In universities north of the Alps, where the air smelled of pine and damp paper and the winters were long and dark, young scholars gathered in candlelit rooms, not to debate doctrine or to win arguments, but to observe. They built their own telescopes, some clumsy and some elegant, and pointed them upward not to prove Galileo right, but simply to see for themselves with their own eyes. In Prague, a former student of Kepler placed Galileo's sketches beside his own observations and found the moons of Jupiter waiting exactly where they should be in the dark sky. He felt a sense of peace settle over him as he recognized the pattern, and he knew that he was connected to a man he had never met by the shared language of the stars. In Paris, a Benedictine monk recalibrated his astrolabe using Galileo's lunar tables and discovered that tides along the Seine rose and fell with a rhythm that matched not the moon alone but the moon and the sun. It was an echo of the earth's motion written in water and visible to anyone who knew how to look at the river with patience. These were not revolutions shouted in the streets. They were quiet confirmations passed hand to hand like warm bread in winter to feed the hungry mind. The scholars did not feel like rebels. They felt like witnesses who had been granted the privilege of seeing the world as it truly was, and they handled that privilege with care and reverence. Even within the church, the ground shifted not with rupture or loud conflict, but with reinterpretation and a slow change of perspective. A Jesuit astronomer in Rome, who was forbidden to cite Galileo by name, published a detailed star chart in 1635 that included the Medicean stars. He labeled them not as moons, but as companions of Jupiter, which was a phrase delicate enough to satisfy senses, yet precise enough to guide sailors across the ocean. In a monastery near Bologna, a novice copied Galileo's description of sunspots into the margin of a psalter not as heresy but as wonder. He wrote the words carefully with a steady hand, and years later, when he became abbot, he allowed a small telescope to be kept in the library wrapped in velvet beside volumes of Aquinas and Augustine. Truth, when it cannot walk through the front door, learns to enter through the garden gate carrying flowers as an offering to those who guard the house. The ideas did not break down the walls. They grew around them and over them until the walls were covered in green and the structure itself was changed by the life that clung to it. The silence of the monastery was no longer empty but filled with the hum of inquiry and the soft scratch of quills writing down what the sky revealed. And Galileo knew this was happening not from praise, for there was little of that in his final years, but from the quality of the silence that surrounded him. Letters still arrived, though fewer now and signed, with initials instead of names to protect the writers from scrutiny. One letter came, wrapped around a small parcel containing a new lens ground in Antwerp. Its curvature was so fine it caught the light like a drop of morning dew, and it fit perfectly into the tube he kept on his desk. No note accompanied it, and none was needed because the gift itself was a message of solidarity and respect. Another letter came from a sailor in Marseille who described how he used Jupiter's moons to check his chronometer on long voyages across the open sea. He wrote that they kept better time than any clock he had known and that they cost nothing but attention and patience. Galileo held that letter in his hands for a long time, and the paper was thin from travel, and the ink was slightly blurred by sea air and salt. He did not smile broadly, but he placed it inside the cover of his working notebook, where it remained a quiet testament to the fact that ideas, once released, belong not to their maker, but to the world that needs them. The sailor was safe on his ship because of what Galileo had seen in his study, and that connection across distance and circumstance was a comfort to him in his isolation. His own work continued not in grand declarations or public lectures, but in small and stubborn acts of care and precision. Though he was nearly blind by the late 1630s and the world had faded into a soft grey haze, he dictated notes on motion to his devoted student Vincenzo Viviani. His voice was soft but precise, and his corrections were patient, and his attention was unwavering even when he could not see. The paper his student was writing on. He revised the discourses onto new sciences not as a final statement of authority, but as an offering to the future. He seemed to say, "Take this not because I am certain, but because I have tried, and this is what remains after the trying." He spoke of falling bodies and pendulums and the strength of materials, which were earthly things and humble things that could be tested by anyone with a string and a weight. When the book was finally printed in Holland in 1638, it was smuggled past papal censors in barrels of olive oil. The scent of the oil soaked into the wood of the barrels and protected the pages from the dampness of the journey. The book contained no mention of the heavens to avoid trouble, yet in its mathematical clarity and in its reverence for observation. Over authority, the whole cosmos was implied. The readers who opened it understood that the laws governing a falling stone were the same laws governing the turning planets, and that unity was the greatest revelation of all. Legacy is not built in a day or in a single moment of triumph. It is built in the space between a question and its answer, and in the time it takes for a seed to break the soil. It is built between a father teaching his daughter to count the moons of Jupiter by lamplight and a printer choosing to set one more line of type despite the risk. It is built between a young woman in a convent reading a forbiddance passage and feeling for the first time that her mind was not too large for the world, but that the world was simply waiting to grow. Galileo could not see the shape his life would take in the centuries ahead because his eyes were closed to the light. But he could feel it forming around him, like warmth returning to cold hands after being out in the winter air. The feeling was gradual and certain and alive, and it filled the rooms of the villa even when the doors were locked. The legacy was no longer his to hold or to protect. It was already in motion, and it was moving through the hands of students and sailors, and monks who carried it forward without knowing the full weight of what they held. And motion, as he had long known, once begun does not easily stop. It continues through the night and through the days and through the generations that follow. The garden outside the villa was tended with care, and the roses bloomed in their season, and the olive trees produced their fruit despite the restrictions placed on the man who lived within the walls. The seasons turned, and the leaves fell, and the snow came, and the flowers bloomed again, and the work of the universe continued without pause. Galileo would sit in the sun and feel the warmth on his face and know that the sun was the center of the system and that the earth was carrying him around it. The knowledge did not make him feel small, but it made him feel connected to something vast and eternal. He was a part of the motion and the light and the gravity that held the stars in place. The cost of clarity had been high, but the reward was this connection to the enduring truth of things. He was no longer an observer standing apart from the universe. He was a participant in the great dance of celestial bodies, and his participation was recorded in the books that traveled in oil barrels and in the letters that traveled in sealed envelopes. The legacy was safe because it was not in one place or one person. It was everywhere where someone looked up and wondered. There were evenings when the wind blew through the cypress trees and the sound was like the ocean rushing in a shell. Galileo would listen to that sound and think of the tides and the moons and the pull that connected them. He would sit in his chair and let the sound wash over him and feel a sense of peace that came from knowing that his work was done. He had planted the seeds, and others would water them, and others would harvest the fruit. He did not need to see the harvest to know that it would come. The faith he had in the truth was stronger than the fear of those who tried to suppress it. He would close his eyes and let the darkness rest him, and in that darkness he could still see the stars moving in their orbits. They were clear and bright, and they did not require his eyes to exist. They were there waiting for anyone who wanted to see them. The legacy was in that waiting and in that availability. It was a gift left on a table for anyone to take and use and share. So let yourself rest in this understanding that what you do with care and truth continues even when you are not there to watch it. Feel the warmth of that continuity in your own body as you lie here in the dark. You are part of a chain of observation and wonder that stretches back through centuries and forward into the future. Galileo's legacy is not just in the books or the telescopes. It is in the act of looking closely and listening deeply. It is in the patience to wait for the truth to reveal itself. You carry this legacy too when you choose to see clearly and to speak gently. The work continues without your effort tonight. The stars will turn and the earth will move and the ideas will spread while you sleep. You can lay down the burden of carrying the truth for a while. It is safe in the hands of time. Let the image of the olive oil barrels and the hidden letters and the quiet students settle in your mind like dust motes in a sunbeam. They are safe and they are resting, and so are you. The legacy is taking shape, and it is beautiful, and it is enough. Time does not erase the things that matter, but instead it wraps around them like linen around a relic, or like ivy around a stone column, or like the slow settling of dust on a closed book that waits on a shelf for the right hands to open it again. Time gathers around a memory not to bury it in darkness, but to preserve it in stillness until the world is ready to receive the truth without fear or resistance. By the time Galileo died in January of 1640 to the storm that had swirled around, his name for so many years had softened into something gentler and quieter. It was not approval yet, and it was not celebration, but it was curiosity that had replaced the anger. His passing was a quiet event on a winter afternoon when the light was pale and the air was still. His hand rested on the edge of a desk that was still marked with pencil notations and diagrams of motion that he had been refining until the very end. There were no last words shouted to the crowd and no dramatic declarations made to the authorities. There was only the slow cessation of breath and the settling of a body that had carried the weight of the heavens for so long. The room was cool and the candle had burned down to a nub, and the silence that followed was not. Empty, but full of the work that remained to be done by others. His burial was modest and took place in the small cloister of Santa Croce, far from the grand tombs of the Medici family who had once been his patrons. He was laid beneath a plain stone with no inscription to mark his name for the passers-by. There were no processions with trumpets and no orations spoken from elevated platforms. There were only a few friends and a handful of students who had remained loyal through the years of restriction. His devoted student Vincenzo. Viviani stood longest after the others had gone, and he watched the candlelight flicker against the cold wall of the cloister, as if he was trying to memorize the shape of the silence itself. He knew that the man who lay beneath the stone was not gone, but had simply become part of the history he had helped to write. The earth covered him gently, and the seasons continued to turn above the grave without pause. The winter snow fell and melted into spring rain, and the grass grew green over the stone, and the world moved on as it always does. But memory once planted refuses to stay underground, and it seeks the light like a seed that knows where the sun must be. Within a decade of his passing, young astronomers across Europe no longer asked if the Earth moved because the question had been answered by the steady accumulation of evidence. They asked instead how fast it moved and how far and with what precision could they measure its path. Telescopes grew longer and lenses became clearer and observatories were built taller on hills where the air was thin and the view was unobstructed. All of this was built on the quiet foundation Galileo had laid, which was the belief that seeing is not arrogance but reverence for the truth of the world. In Paris, the Royal Academy began its nightly sky logs using his method of timed observation and careful recording. They did not speak his name loudly, but they used his tools and followed his procedures, and the results spoke for themselves. In Oxford, a professor taught planetary motion with drawings copied not from Ptolemy, but from Galileo's own sketches. The moons orbited in faithful ellipses on the chalkboard, and the students copied them into their notebooks without questioning the source. The knowledge had become so integrated into the study of the sky that it felt like it had always been there waiting to be found. Even in Rome, where his dialogue remained, on the index of forbidden books, a new generation of Jesuit scientists quietly incorporated his empirical rigor into their own work. They cited certain modern observers with a knowing glance and a lowered voice. But the work was done, and the calculations were made using the methods he had pioneered. The world was not rewriting history in a dramatic fashion, but was simply beginning to live inside the truth he had offered. Living day after day inside a new understanding is the most persuasive argument of all, because it becomes the normal way of seeing things. The sun rose in the east and the earth turned to meet it, and the seasons followed their predictable path, and no one felt the ground shift beneath their feet, because the change was in the mind and not in the stone. The certainty of the old world had dissolved not with a crash, but with a slow fading, like a star that dims over. Centuries until it is no longer visible to the naked eye. His daughters were gone by then, and the house in Archetri was quiet in a way that it had not been when they were alive. Sister Maria Celeste had died in 1634, and her letters were bundled and tied with faded ribbon and kept in Galileo's drawer like sacred fragments of a life that had been lived in devotion. Livia had followed soon after, and her life had been quieter and her grief deeper, and her hands were stilled forever over the embroidery she had loved to create. But their presence lingered in the way Viviani spoke of Galileo's patience when he taught new students. It lingered in the way he hummed the same melodies Galileo had sung to them as children when the evening light was soft. It lingered in the small garden he tended at the villa in Archetri, where he planted white roses because Virginia had once said they smelled like peace. The flowers bloomed in their season, and the scent drifted through the open windows and reminded anyone who smelled it that love outlasts the body that holds it. Memory is not only in monuments of stone or bronze, but in gestures repeated without thought. It is in a cup placed just so on the desk, and a window open to catch the evening breeze, and a pause before speaking as if listening for an answer that may yet come from the past. Years passed, and then decades, and the telescope, which was once a curiosity, became a necessity for navigation and science. It was mounted on ships' masts and balanced on mountain peaks and carried into desert observatories where the air was so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch with a hand. Sailors used the moons of Jupiter to chart longitude across uncharted seas, and this saved ships from crashing on rocks and helped them find their way home to their families. Cartographers redrew the heavens not as symbols of divine order, but as spaces that were vast and measurable and alive with motion. The maps were updated and the globes were turned to reflect the new understanding, and children in schools learned to trace the orbits with their fingers without feeling that they were touching something forbidden. The knowledge had become safe and useful, and it belonged to everyone who looked up. Slowly and gently the church itself began to shift, not with reversal or apology, but with reinterpretation that acknowledged the complexity of the world. A papal astronomer in the late 1600s wrote of Galileo not as a heretic, but as a man who loved the stars too well to let them remain silent. The words were careful, but they opened a door that had been closed for a long time. By 1718 his works were no longer forbidden, but only cautioned, like strong wine offered to the unaccustomed who might not be ready for its strength. And in 1757 the ban on heliocentric books was quietly lifted, not with fanfare or proclamation, but with a single line in an updated index. It was as if the tide had simply turned, and no one needed to announce it anymore, because the water had already receded from the shores of the old dogma. The silence of the decree was louder than any shout could have been, because it signaled that the battle was over, and the truth had won without needing to defeat anyone. Yet the most tender echoes of his life were not in decrees or instruments or academic papers, but in the ordinary moments of daily life. A mother in Naples pointed to the evening sky and said to her son, "Look, there is Jupiter, and if you had a good lens you would see his little companions dancing around him." The boy looked up and wondered, and the wonder was passed from one generation to the next like a flame protected from the wind. A schoolboy in Leiden built a telescope from a tube and to borrowed lenses, and he whispered Galileo's name as he adjusted the focus, not as a rebel, but as a guide who showed him where to look. A poet in Florence centuries later wrote lines about light bending through glass, and about truth arriving not in thunder but in the slow clarity of a lens finally polished clean. These were not acts of worship or devotion to a saint, but acts of continuation that kept the spirit of inquiry alive. They were small and unnoticed by history books, but they were the true legacy of the man who taught the world to see. These acts of continuation were scattered across the world like seeds carried by the wind that take root in unexpected places. A clockmaker in London adjusted his mechanisms based on the pendulum studies, and his clocks kept time more accurately for the merchants in the square. A farmer in Tuscany looked at the moon and knew the tides would be high, and he moved his boats to safety without knowing the name of the man who explained the connection. A nun in a convent far away read a forbidden passage copied into the margin of a prayer book, and felt for the first time that her mind was not too large for the world, but that the world was simply waiting to grow into her understanding. The ideas travelled without passports and without permission, and they found homes in minds that were ready to receive them. The legacy was not a statue in a square, but a way of thinking that became part of the air people breathed. Time had gathered around the memory of Galileo, and in its gathering he was no longer the man who defied authority in the popular imagination. He was the man who taught the world how to look, and in doing so he gave humanity back its oldest gift, which was the right to wander quietly under an open sky. The controversy faded into the background like a storm that moves over the horizon and leaves the air washed clean. The trials and the decrees became footnotes in books that were read by scholars, but the feeling of looking through the lens remained universal. It belonged to the child and the sailor and the poet and the dreamer, who all shared the same impulse to see what was hidden. The memory was safe now because it was no longer dependent on one person or one institution to protect it. It was woven into the fabric of how people understood their place in the universe. So let yourself rest in this understanding that time is not an enemy that steals things away, but a friend that preserves what is true. Feel the weight of that preservation in your own body as you lie here in the dark. You are part of this gathering of time and memory. The things you value and the truths you hold are being wrapped in linen and kept safe for the future. Galileo's story is not over because it continues in every act of curiosity. The memory is alive, and it is breathing, and it is waiting for you to join it. The quiet of the cloister, and the scent of the white roses, and the sound of the turning pages are all part of this peaceful accumulation of history. Let the image of the plain stone and the flickering candlelight settle in your mind. Let the knowledge that the work continues without urgency bring peace to your heart. The memory is gathered and it is complete and it is ready for the final reflection. The world has accommodated the new shape and it is comfortable now. The tension is gone and only the stillness remains. Time has done its work and now it is time for you to rest in the shadow of that great and quiet legacy. Even now, centuries later, if you walk through the hills above Florence on a clear autumn night, you can find a quiet spot where the city lights fade into the distance and the sky opens wide like a dark velvet curtain, pulled back to reveal the depth of the universe. If you stand very still in that spot with your feet planted on the cool earth and your hands resting gently at your sides, you might feel it not as a memory of the past and not as a monument made of stone, but as a continuation of a moment that never truly ended. The same cool air that brushed Galileo's face as he adjusted his lens 400 years ago still moves across your skin. Tonight, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp soil and the faint metallic taste of the coming dew. The same stars he traced, with trembling ink on sheets of rough paper, still gleam overhead, not brighter and not newer, but only seen finally with the patience they deserve after centuries of being rushed by busy eyes. The telescope he built from lead and glass is long gone now, and its brass fittings are worn smooth by time, and its lenses are clouded by the slow accumulation of dust, but the gesture remains intact and alive in the hands of anyone who chooses to look. The gesture of lifting one's eyes away from the ground and toward the infinite. The gesture of steadying the hands against the tremor of uncertainty. The gesture of leaning forward just slightly into the unknown without fear of what might be found there. She does not know the weight of the history she is touching, but she feels the wonder of it in her bones as the blurry dots sharpen into moons that dance around a giant planet. It lives in a sailor off the coast of Chile who checks his navigation not by GPS alone, but by the slow and faithful dance of Jupiter's moons, just as Galileo predicted, and just as he hoped when he wrote his letters by candlelight. The sailor stands on the deck of a rolling ship with the salt spray on his face and the wind in his hair, and he feels a connection to a man who died centuries before the ship was built, because they both share the same trust in the rhythm of the heavens. These are not isolated moments, but threads in a single tapestry that stretches across oceans and centuries, weaving together the solitary observer in Padua, with the curious child in the north and the navigator in the south and the teacher in the east. You do not need a telescope to join this lineage of quiet observers, and you do not need a degree or a title or a permission slip from any authority to look up and wonder. You only need to pause here and now as you listen to feel the weight of your own breath and the stillness of your own attention in this quiet room. Think of the last time you looked up and truly saw something without trying to name it or capture it or use it for something else. Think of the arc of a bird in flight cutting across a grey sky, or the curve of the moon cradled in twilight like a silver boat, or the way light shifts in a room as evening deepens and the shadows grow long and soft against the wall. That impulse to notice is the same impulse that drove Galileo to grind lenses until his fingers were sore. That courage to look is the same courage that kept him writing when the world told him to be silent. To look is not to conquer the sky, and it is not to possess the stars or to claim them as your own property. It is to witness. It is to say quietly and without demand, I am here and I am watching and I am ready to see what you show me. This act of witnessing is a form of participation in the life of the universe, and it requires nothing from you except your presence and your openness. Galileo never claimed to have finished the work of understanding the cosmos, and he knew better than to think that any single mind could hold all the answers. He knew that science is not a fortress to be built and guarded against intruders, but a path to be walked generation after generation, with each step adding a little more light to the way ahead. The path is not straight, and it is not easy, and sometimes it leads into dark woods where the way forward is unclear, but the walking itself is the purpose. Every time a student asks, but why, instead of accepting because it has always been so, Galileo is there standing beside them in spirit, holding the lamp steady so they can see the question clearly. Every time a researcher revises a theory because the data does not fit, even when it means rewriting years of work and admitting a mistake, Galileo is there nodding with approval because he knows that clarity is more important than pride. Every time someone chooses curiosity over comfort and patience over certainty and observation over assumption, he is there not as a statue on a pedestal, but as a companion in the dark, holding the tube steady and whispering, "Try again," because the sky is still speaking, and it has not run out of things to say. The conversation between humanity and the universe is ongoing, and it is gentle, and it invites everyone who wants to listen to pull up a chair and join in. And tonight, as you rest with your body softening into the mattress and your thoughts drifting like smoke toward the ceiling, you are part of that same quiet fellowship of observers who have come before and who will come after. You are not too late to join the journey, and you are not too small to make a difference in the grand scheme of things. To listen deeply to the sounds of your own life, to trust your own eyes and your own experience, even when the world insists you close them, and accept what you are told without question. The telescope still points upward in museums and in observatories and in the minds of those who remember how to ask questions. The stars still turn with their ancient and unhurried grace, marking time not in seconds but in epochs. And you here and now, breathing in the dark with your heart beating a steady rhythm against your ribs, are still watching. You are the current endpoint of a long line of sight that stretches back to the caves and forward to the stars. There is a profound peace in knowing that you do not have to solve the mysteries of the universe tonight to be worthy of rest. The stars will continue their dance whether you understand their steps or not. The earth will continue its rotation whether you track its speed or not. The work of understanding is a collective effort that spans centuries, and you are allowed to lay down your part of the burden for now. You have done enough by simply being present and by listening to the story of a man who looked up when everyone else looked down. You have honored his memory by giving yourself the space to wonder along with him. Now let the wonder become sleep. Let the questions become dreams. Let the sharp edges of curiosity soften into the roundness of rest. The sky is vast enough to hold all your questions until morning. The darkness is deep enough to cradle all your thoughts until you are ready to face them again. You are safe in this moment, and you are held by the same gravity that holds the moons in their orbit. You are part of the system, and the system is at peace. So let your eyes close fully now, and let the images of the hills and the telescopes and the stars fade into the soft grey of sleep. The journey through history has reached a resting place, but the journey of the spirit continues in the dreams you will have tonight. You may dream of flying, or of falling, or of standing still under a wide open sky. The universe is unfolding around you, and you are unfolding with it. There is no rush and there is no deadline. There is only this breath and the next breath and the slow turning of the world beneath you. The telescope points upward and the sky waits and you sleep. The story is complete for now, but the wonder remains. The wonder remains in the silence between your breaths. The wonder remains in the beat of your heart. The wonder remains, and it is yours. Let your body soften gradually into the surface beneath you as the final echoes of Galileo's story settle like dust in a sunlit study. The journey through candlelit rooms and starlit hills has reached its gentle conclusion, and the weight of certainty has given way to the lightness of wonder. You have walked through silence and slow courage, and you have done so not as a distant observer, but as a fellow traveller in the long human tradition of looking up and asking not with arrogance, but with awe, what if we see again? The story itself is now complete, and the words have finished their work, and there is nothing left for you to hold or to remember or to analyze. The history has been told and the lessons have been shared, and now there is only the quiet space that remains where you can rest, without any need to carry the narrative forward. The mind can release the images of the telescope and the moons and the letters and let them drift away like clouds moving across an evening sky. You have done the work of listening, and now you are free to do the work of sleeping. Thank you for staying with me until the very last word, and for trusting your evening to this quiet retelling of a life lived in pursuit of clarity. You have allowed history to speak not as a lesson to be memorized, but as a lullaby to be remembered, and that is a gift that you have given to yourself and to this space. Your presence here matters not as a statistic or a number on a screen, but as companionship beneath the same sky Galileo once mapped with trembling hands and a heart full of reverence. You are part of the quiet fellowship of listeners who gather in the dark to share in the wonder of the past and to find peace in the present moment. If you wish, leave a note in the comments, not as a review or a demand, but as a simple presence to mark your place in the night. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, or what constellation rests above your window, or simply share the feeling of the room you are in. I read each one not as data, but as a shared breath in the dark and a reminder that we are all resting beneath the same vast and turning sky. Your words become part of the quiet tapestry of this community, and they help too weave a sense of connection that spans distances and time zones. But if you prefer to remain silent, that is also welcome and understood, because sometimes the deepest connection is the one that requires no words at all. The important thing is that you are here and that you are resting and that you have allowed yourself, this time, to drift away from the demands of the day. Now let your thoughts drift like smoke toward the ceiling, and let the tension in your shoulders dissolve like sugar in warm tea. Let the awareness that you are here and now and breathing in the dark and resting your body and softening your mind settle over you like a blanket woven from centuries of quiet observation. You are still watching and still present and still part of that unbroken line of curiosity and care that stretches from the past into the future. Let the telescope still pointing upward somewhere in the quiet of a museum case or the corner of a scholar's study remind you that the act of looking has never truly ended and that the universe is always waiting for you to return to it when you are ready. So let go not all at once, but gradually as a river surrenders to the sea, and let the sky hold you now not as a distant vault of light, but as a companion vast and tender and wrapping you in its depth. The centuries fold gently around you like the pages of a well-loved book closing at last, and each chapter is complete, and each word is honored, and each silence is given its due weight. There is nothing more that needs to be said and nothing more that needs to be done, and the night is deep and safe and ready to receive you. When you wake, may you carry not a fact to recite, but a feeling to live by, and the quiet and unshakable certainty that clarity, when offered with patience and humility and love, is always worth the cost and always worth the wait and always worth the stillness required to see it arrive. You have earned this rest, and you have earned this peace, and you have earned the right to let go completely. Sleep well and rest deeply, and know that somewhere in the soft hum of the universe the next story is already waiting for you to return and listen again. The world will continue to turn, and the stars will continue to shine, and the earth will continue its silent journey through the dark while you sleep. The day is done, and the story is told, and the night is yours to keep. Let the darkness be soft, and let the silence be kind, and let the sleep come easily and without effort. You are ready, and you are willing, and you are free to drift into the dreams that wait beneath the surface of the night. Good night, and safe travels in your rest, and may the sky hold you until the morning light returns.